Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in our series on Mississippi and the Civil War, which was conducted at the Old Capitol Museum in Jackson, Mississippi in November of 1996. Our last lecturer today is someone who you've already gotten to know in several other presentations. Herman Hattaway loves coming on BGES tours, where the food is great, the amenities are nice, and the company is entirely pleasant. And so Herman was invited back again to join us yet once more in Jackson, because he had another book that he had written that he could represent and present to you. As I have mentioned before, Herman, I believe, is almost certainly retired, and he maybe even has passed. If he's not, he's certainly got to be in his late 80s, maybe even 90-ish or so. He is part of the old core, the old generation. Archer Jones has passed away. I think Richard Behringer may still be alive, but probably retired up in North or South Dakota. And Bill Steele is long ago retired from East Carolina University and resettled out in Hawaii. So this group of intellects who had many of them had cut their teeth at the foot of T. Harry Williams in and around LSU, all come back, and now at this stage they are 28, 30 years into their own professional careers, and they are the deans of the profession. In this case, what Herman did was he dusted off another of his works that he then turned into a publication, and he came to read to people on Letters from Forest Place, which I thought was a great finish to this program. It gave people an insight into who war really truly affects and how it affected people, especially having just had Mark Grimsley talk about the Union Army practicing the hard hand of war from Jackson to Meridian, Mississippi. I thought that just looking into the war and life in Mississippi through the eyes of the people who were experiencing it would be a worthy finish to this program. So I invite you to truly relax, have a mint julep, sit back, and enjoy with Herman Hattaway his presentation on Letters from Forest Place.
It has been a fine Blue-Gray Education Society meeting. I'm always very delighted and honored to be invited to join one of these affairs. And I think we have our plans plotted out for several campaigns next year. To begin with the U in San Antonio at the end of January, spilling into the early part of February. Letters from Forest Place is a compendium of a book-sized body of correspondence that covers a period between 1846 and 1881 of plantation families' correspondence. Forest Place was a very, very large plantation, about 85 miles plus or minus a couple north of here, due north of here, between present-day Winona and Carrollton, but nearest to Middleton, Mississippi. Now, Middleton, Mississippi does not exist anymore, but the Lions Club has gone out and gathered up the stones from the cemetery and restored them and restored that cemetery. It's a very interesting thing to see if you ever find yourself up in that part of the country. Winona, being on the railroad, grew and somewhat modernized and is a somewhat thriving small city. Carrollton, on the other hand, did not. It's still there. It's an interesting place to visit. More interesting, I think, than Winona. But the building's very, very, very old, and it's quite a quaint place. This family was that of Dr. Thomas A. Watkins and his wife and their two daughters, and then ultimately their two daughters' husbands and the grandchildren produced by these two daughters. And then, as it turns out, the family will ultimately move from Mississippi to Texas, where the granddaughter of the oldest daughter in this story, Louise Mimi Parmalee Johnson, who was in fact still alive 3 years ago and pushing hard on the age of 100 when we published this compendium of letters. The University Press of Mississippi did it for us. Now, this family came originally from Alabama. And Dr. Watkins, he was a medical doctor, and he'd acquired enough wherewithal as a practitioner of medicine to buy quite a nice place in Mississippi to grow cotton. And he never practiced medicine again because in those days growing cotton was a lot more lucrative. But they lost everything as the war came to a close. They even in fact lost the mother person. She does die just before the war is over. And so they originated in Alabama, moved to Mississippi, thrived for a time to be sure, certainly identified themselves as Mississippians, but then subsequently left the state. And the letters were preserved and gradually made known to another relative of the family who happened to be Dr. E. Gray Diamond, who was the first provost of the medical school at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I don't happen to know his precise age, but my best guess is he's about 10 years my senior, maybe 15, and plus or minus a year or two in there. I know for sure that he's a bit older than I am, but not a great deal. And as a medical doctor, he was very interested in not only the letters of his relatives, but also that the scion of the family was a non-practicing medical man. But he did not have the historical skills to put this thing together in an edited, publishable book, so he found me. And I was just utterly delighted to join him in putting this thing together. We've been reasonably well received by those who have already read this book and those who have reviewed it. The reviews have not altogether been totally favorable. One person took us badly and harshly to task, I thought, because a number of letters are by the slaves of the family. And they clearly reflect a degree of harmony and satisfaction and of affection for the family. And of course, in this modern world, you're not supposed to offer any purported evidence that slaves had affection for the family. But on the other hand, that didn't mean, and we didn't mean to say, that they had affection for being slaves. None of them stayed after the war. And I think all of them were quite delighted not to be slaves anymore. And who could be surprised? A British visitor to Mobile, Alabama wrote that people lived in cotton houses and ride in cotton carriages. They buy cotton and sell cotton and think cotton and eat cotton and drink cotton and dream cotton. They marry cotton wives and unto them born cotton children. Well, that is, of course, quite hyperbolic, but they are lines that remind us that cotton was a great, important revenue crop. And there was a time when wealth was measured in one's carriages and cotton. We had originally intended to entitle this thing Carriages and Cotton, but the University of Mississippi Press thought that it would market better in a somewhat more descriptive title, so we agreed. But nonetheless, in our dedication to the granddaughter who preserved the letters, we say, who recalls herself first-hand accounts of the days when the Watkins family measured its well-being in carriages and cotton. The oldest daughter, Letty, had been born in Alabama and was beginning to reach some level of maturity and interest in the opposite sex as the 1850s began. And she, in fact, found the person that she would eventually marry, but Dr. Watkins was much concerned that his lovely and adored firstborn should marry eventually into a family that he considered good enough. And in this he was to be sorely disappointed. Sometime in the second half of 1852, Letty met the person that would be her husband-to-be, a handsome young lawyer just home from the University of Virginia named William Martin Walton. And Dr. Watkins was not at all pleased with Mr. Walton. We think he wrote to her in a letter, "You can do better." And he wanted her to do better, and when she didn't, he was most upset. And for an extended period of time, the doctor, the father, this guy in the family was estranged from his wife and her new husband. Nothing works magic quite so as does grandchildren to settle and ease enmity between a father and a daughter, and that is ultimately what did happen. Mary, the younger of the Watkins daughters, was born in Mississippi, and in the mid-1850s she begins her correspondence. Her writing efforts are impressive considering her tender age, and they reflect the gloom that often prevails in the Watkins home, not only because the father's ill will persists so long, but of course too there are ominous clouds looming to suggest that all is not well in the nation. The 1850s, I think, is a troubled decade, and especially so in the second half, when we entitled the letters that are gathered together that form that chapter there for the second half of the 1850s, Twilight of Tranquility. To Letty and her husband Will Walton has been born a son, Newton Samuel Walton, born in Austin, Texas on the 12th of March, 1855. And in April of 1856, she finds herself pregnant again and comes back here to Mississippi for a visit. First, she stays at the home of one of her parents' neighbors, but then Dr. Watkins finally relents and sends his carriage for her and the grandchild. And the second son, Early Watkins Walton, will be born in the Watkins home in Carroll County, Mississippi on the 1st of September, 1856. Mary, meanwhile, the younger child, commences school in the fall of 1857. She matriculates at the Reverend Chevalier's Holly Springs Female Institute. And after 1 year there, Dr. Watkins, apparently finding that Female Institute inadequate, transfers her to Patapsco Female Institute at Ellicott's Mill in Maryland near Baltimore. But that's getting powerful close to Yankee country, and they do fret about that a lot. Mary does spend 3 school years at the Patapsco Female Institute, where she acquires much polish and grace, as is illustrated by the marked progress she does make over time, becoming quite an accomplished correspondent, perhaps the most charming of the family members. The vast bulk of these letters are written by one or the other of the daughters to Mrs. Watkins, so there are indeed a goodly number from Mrs. Watkins to the daughters. Now and again, the daddy person does write a letter, and as I say, even on occasion, so too do the slaves. The national sectional controversy seems to attract but scant attention in their correspondence, but they do suffer numerous tragedies. There is much sickness, and death often visits them. Many acquaintances die, and many slaves die, and they are quite sad, of course, the slaves die, partly because they do have a certain amount of affection binding between them, and of course also because that is the loss of investment capital. Only a truly foolish slave master would take any delight at all in seeing a slave be sick or maimed or die. Well, that is a loss of capital investment. The gathering storm clouds of war also do witness the time when one of the more remarkable of the letters is written. The letters that include passages by these slaves. And I think it's interesting, too, that at least one of them likes the song Dixie and also seems to have a lot of affection for the South itself, not perhaps for the Confederate States of America, but for the South. Here now are some extracts from several of the servants writing to Molly, Mary, Baby. This is all the same person, the younger of the two daughters of Patapsco, Maryland. This one on the 27th of January, 1861, when, of course, as you doubtless already know, Mississippi has already seceded from the Union. These servants, of course, at this particular point in time have no surnames. Martha, Chloe, Amelia, Polly, and America, they were named. It may well be, as was often the case, that in freedom they took the surname of the family. That's not always the case, but it's frequently the case. In fact, also quite often when slaves become free, they don't want to be associated by name with the old family, so that varies to be sure. So here we are, dear Miss Mary, and all these are slaves that are being referred to by name. Martha has another boy, 7 weeks old tonight, named Jeff Longstreet. Alberta is very intelligent and pretty as she was when you were here. All my family are well. Charlotte is growing very fast. She ought to come home and put her to work. Asta has a girl named Hannah. She will not work no longer than she is looked over, and she can outdance anything in the place. We had a fine time last night with our own people, just our own people. Peyton to play the violin and banjo, Simon played on the tambourine, Susan helped with quilting, and after we got the quilt out, we had to dance instead of a supper. Now listen to this one. This is also from the affectionate servant. Harry Ann stood up in the corner clapping her foot, and she wanted us to keep on singing to drown the noise of the pots and ovens. She done that to keep us from thinking about having anything cooked. You must get the song, Dixieland. You must get the song, Dixieland. I made my stand, I live and die for Dixieland. Learn to play it on the guitar and play it for me when you come home. And then here's another different slave. Chloe, baby, his cousin Martha has written you, I will let you see I have not forgotten you. I'm staying home this year and anxious for the time to arrive for you to come home, so we may see happy times together like we used to when we were all little girls. And here's still another of the slave women. Baby, I am almost ashamed to write, as I have not written you before this. I enjoyed myself finely last night looking at the young folks dancing. Uncle Vivian came around the corner grumbling because the music gained so many soldiers last night. I am going to Quilton, and I hope the young people will enjoy themselves as they did last night. I am too poor to give a supper. I have a half a gallon of flour coming, but I must keep it for my fatherless children. So those are, I think, interesting passages. Here now is one from Mrs. Walton, the mama, 28 January 61, to Letty, my dear child. There was a mule driver here yesterday that told us that he'd heard that Jeff Davis had got to Grenada from Washington City and said all was peace and there would be no war. Glorious news, if true. Well, it is true that Jeff Davis said that. But as we know, it wasn't true that there wasn't going to be still in the early months of 1861, the family continued much to hope that. Here is an extract from a February 16, 1861 letter, also to Betty from the mother. Washington and Anna, these little slaves, are going to be married tonight. Anna has borrowed Ritter's wedding dress to wear. Ritter says Harry Ann is mad with her for letting Anna have her dress. Washington's parents don't want him to have Anna, so I hear that Negroes. Anna is much of a child to marry, but we think if they are allowed to marry, that they will be keeping each other, and we had better let them marry. And so on it goes. I believe Jane is a good girl, and I would want her to have a very nice wedding supper, so I'm going to see to that. But here now comes the firing on Fort Sumter, and Dr. Watkins writes Molly, this is the younger child, on the 12th of April, 1861, not yet knowing of the tragedy, with a sense of irony, I think. He thinks that this young daughter of his has already seen the happiest days of her life. And that's very sad for a father to be writing to a young girl away at school. The last of June will soon be here, and then you will be a grown young lady. You think there will be so much fun in store for you after you graduate, but I fear it may be otherwise. There's been much sickness and some fatality in the county this spring. The war is on the way, and yet still the doctor and his wife hope that it is all talk. Letty's husband, Will, joined the volunteer company in Texas. This unit soon laid plans to walk the more than 100 miles from where they live to Port Lavaca, Texas, to try to seize the U.S. property there. Impending war affected the Watkins' Mississippi neighborhood, too. On Monday, the 29th of April, 1861, the first company of volunteers left Carrollton and went first to an assembly camp at Corinth, and soon thereafter in Training War, Virginia, where they would be in the battles in that state. Many eager volunteers flocked to the colors at this early stage of the hostilities. Various lively social gatherings were held to honor the volunteers. The doctor joined the Home Guards. Mary, home from Patapsco, writes letters that reflect a self-conscious charm. She commenced a romance via correspondence with her soon-to-be husband, Jeff McLemore. A sewing society was organized to make clothes and other items for the Winona Stars, one of the many new military units, and for the other soldiers mustering in Mississippi. Jeff saw combat in the first battle of Manassas. Although he was lucky to leave the battle unscathed, he drew the sad duty of receiving the body of his first lieutenant, who had been killed in the action, and overseeing the burial. Alas, the war was not just all talk. In April of 1861, Letty writes to her sister, Mary. Sister, these are indeed eventful times we're living in, and though I shall direct this to Patapsco, I hope you are still there to be able to receive it. Will has joined a volunteer company which is being organized now in this place. That's in Austin, Texas. This company expects to start this week or next Monday to Fort Lavaca, which is over 100 miles from here, and walk to take possession of some property there now that the United States owns. I would feel more secure in Mississippi than in this state, see, she's in Texas, if we do really have war. Yet I would not be willing to go there and leave Will here. It does seem foolish for intelligent beings to involve their country in civil war, but I believe we will have war, and it will only be fulfilling some of the prophecies in the Bible. That's my notion about it. The Lord's will be done. I think Letty was far from alone in this belief. Actually, it was more of a typical phenomenon among Northern Protestants, which by now had long since officially separated from the Southern churches, separate denominations. Of course, the Baptists are still separated. Not, obviously, any longer, or for quite some years now. But in all cases, probably the differences in theology were great and deep. And I think that helped to make this such a hard and hard-pressed war. Because in some respects it was a holy war, and in some respects both sides believed that God was on their side. Well, have you ever heard of anyone sitting around saying, gee, this is really going to be a tough war? God's on the other side. In Texas, Letty's church could not raise enough money to keep paying the preacher, so he joined the army as a chaplain. In Mississippi, Mary was enormously busy, entertaining company, knitting, sewing for soldiers, helping raise money. She and her mother commenced teaching school. And still another letter from one of the slaves occurs, even as the war is going on. As winter wears on and the war is clearly invading the lives of the entire caste, though they tend to express that impact in different degrees of intensity, in everyone's correspondence, there's no more serious issue than life or death, as gradually the young men they know and care so much about begin to disappear from the community and go off to war. And people share, too, the sad news that comes all too often about those that have been killed in action. And here in early February of 1862, the doctor writes to a business associate, the price paid for cotton, which keeps up this trade, ranges from 8 to 10 cents the pound. According to the distance of transportation of water communication, the better price being, of course, paid for the staple when delivered at the nearest bay of Matagorda. But that's a pretty low price for cotton. Much gloom was cast, he says, over the minds and hearts of all our patriotic men and women by the news of the defeated Somerset. That's a battle that has several different names, fought on the 19th of January of 62 in Kentucky, which was an ominous omen for the Western theater, that is to say, all of us who are west of the Appalachian Mountains, where, of course, the most important part of the Civil War occurred, in spite of what those people in Virginia keep trying to tell us. Much gloom because of this, and because of the death of the gallant General Zollicoffer. I say all our patriotic men and women because we have an element amongst us which is neither Southern in sentiment nor gladsome at heart when success attends the efforts of our brave men. I'm sorry to make such an admission, but it is the truth. Well, what are we going to do about these Southerners that are not loyal to the South? You see, what happened at that battle, not only did the Southerners lose a general who wasn't really very much good anyway, Zollicoffer, they were trying to defend en cordon, a line, a ribbon defense. And when it broke, as it did do there, that's what set the stage. That's what set things up for the Fort Henry and Donelson campaigns. And those are preludes then subsequently to the invasion of Mississippi, even ultimately the Vicksburg campaign. Here now is a letter that also is in February of 62, the mama to Letty, the oldest daughter. A good many of our Carroll County boys were killed or taken prisoner. Tom Booth, Bill Palmer, Hugh and Phil Freeman, George Weisinger, Tom Allen from Dug Hill. Many others that you don't know, either killed or prisoners, but then many that you do know. And then too, Jimmy Smith and others, Charlie Campbell, Tom Collins, went through it all without a scratch. Poor creatures, they've had a hard time of it. Oh, Letty, what awful times we're passing through now, so different from what it was when we last saw each other. It's just as much as we can do here to get enough to eat. I feel thankful for anything to live on. Bread and meat is all we can get. She's not doing too badly. I've been out of flour, though, ever since September, and don't expect to have any more until wheat comes in. So things aren't all that good. But she did receive an affectionate letter from Baby, and so she writes back on the 24th of February, 62. I would have answered you before this time, lady, if it hadn't been for the gloomy times with all of us in the neighborhood. I expect you've heard about the defeat of the Confederacy at Fort Donelson. The loss is said to be 12,000. Judge Drake and his company and Dan Russell's company were taken prisoners. Russell escaped by not being in the fight. He had his ankle hurt some weeks ago. He's returned to Carrollton, trying to work up and get up another regiment. Mr. George, Mr. Barnes, George Wellens, Robert Palmer, William Whitehead, Judge Drake, Joe B. are missing in action, thought to be taken prisoners. All this is different, you see, when you know these people. We've had a very wet winter. The ground's not been in order to garden. Peas are the only seed I've sown. Today is very pretty though, and the wind is blowing and dry. The ground is beginning to dry, and we may get some seeds sown. But as the war continues to wear on, one writes, this looks ominous, don't it? This looks ominous, don't it? Early 1862, pushing on toward the middle of the year. Here now, a letter to Letty, my dear beloved child. This is dated 27 June 62. Sam Walton was killed in the Battle of Chickahominy, Virginia. William Hamilton had 3 fingers on his hand shot off. Price McLemore has been slightly wounded in the head. He had fought on when his gun was struck him, stunned. Jeff had to come to join a cavalry company. He heard Price was badly wounded and went to Virginia to see about him, expecting to bring his corpse home, but Price has narrowly recovered. Jeff did return home last Saturday. He speaks of joining John Hunt Morgan, the thunderbolt of the Confederacy, the famous guerrilla leader from Kentucky. 6 weeks from tomorrow, Mrs. Sam McLemore and Jeff spent the day here. Jeff was here the Saturday before. He brought baby a pretty horn cub of his own make. The Federals had possession of Memphis and Holly Springs, and are now trying to take Vicksburg. The papers say depredations were committed when they took Holly Springs. A great many soldiers from above passed Winona Wednesday going down to Vicksburg. A fight is expected there. We have meat, molasses, sugar, and coffee yet. I don't know what we'll do for more when what we have gives out. Don't know that we'll be able to get it at all when it's all gone. Here now in November of 62. Very glad to hear from you that you received my 2 letters. I am sorry Galveston is captured. That was a false rumor. Galveston held out almost another year. We have made a pretty good corn crop. I don't know. We kill 2 hogs a week. That's the only meat we have for ourselves and my neighbors to eat. I have a few chickens, not many turkeys. Shoes and clothes are hard to get. I'm having my ground peas dug. I wish Newton and Early were here to eat them. Those, of course, are the 2 grandchildren. But then on into 1863, one writes the line, I am afraid Mississippi will be gone. There occurred the battles of Port Gibson, Raymond, the fall of Jackson, and Champions Hill, and the commencement of the siege of Vicksburg. And despite that bitter reality, on went the lives of these people. Day by day, they did the best they could. Sheila Hilder, that's a nephew of the doctor who had become a quartermaster in the Confederate service, did the best he could to help the doctor's needs, but the Confederate Army's ever-increasing needs continued to make escalating demands, not only on the doctor, but on all the planters, and they strove mightily to try to comply. The doctor, too, also tried to oblige his friends, who knew that he stacked his ice house each winter, and was sometimes a generous man. And so he did send ice as a gift from time to time during the summer. But then, finally, things truly wound to their bitter close. And on the 20th of September, 1864, Mrs. Walton and Mrs. Watkins wrote the last letter that has been found to her son-in-law, William Walton. And she says, this is on the 20th of September 64, if this war lasts much longer, I fear I will never see you and your dear family again. I'm getting old and begin to sometime yesterday. I'm taking quinine, feel nearly well today. A Yankee raid passed through recently, but did very little injury. This, of course, was Grierson. And then Grierson's last raid, which ran from the 19th of December 64 to the 5th of January 65, is written about. The raid passed through our neighborhood on the 1st of January. Miss Wendell, a visitor at our home from Oxford, Mississippi, advised to put on our best clothing and hide whatever was of any value. Because Grierson in his previous raid had shown such ungentlemanly behavior. I was trying to hide a nice shawl on top of the teaster of my bed when I heard, "The Yankees are coming, the Yankees are coming." In my haste to get down from my high position, I fell and tore my nice black silk dress. I suppose the raid numbered about 1,000 men, white and black. My dear mother asked an officer, please not to let the Negro soldiers come into our house, which request was granted. Some of the officers and soldiers asked, "Why are you so dressed up? You must be expecting company." Mother replied, "Well, I think we have company." In a few moments, soldiers occupied the house, and they took everything that was of value with them, and they destroyed a great deal they could not take. They robbed us of our mules, horses, bed clothing, provisions, went into our trunks, said they were looking for clothing. Mother had carefully tied packages which one soldier anxiously untied. You ought to have seen his countenance change. We found only dried rose leaves. He inquired, "What do you want leaves for? To make tea for the little Negro babies?" They went into Uncle Cicero Kennedy's toolbox, breaking block and scattering tools for which they had no earthly use. I gave them Mr. Kennedy's wedding suit, locked in a carpet bag for which I'd paid $30. And an old Negro, Uncle Mark, was going to hide them for me from the Yankees. Uncle Mark said, "I will show you. I'll bring the suit back, Miss Jeannie. Don't worry about that." But to my surprise, the next day, Uncle Mark came up and the carpet bag was gone in pieces and the suit was gone. From our home, they went to grandmother's where they acted in a similar manner. They didn't leave her anything to eat, took her chickens, threw them up in the air, cut them with their sabers as they came down. Why they showed such hatred to a 70-year-old lady, I can't tell, unless they knew she had 3 noble sons in the Confederate Army. But then the next letter indicates that Mrs. Watkins has died, and the funeral services will be held on Friday the 24th of March at 10 o'clock in the morning, 1865. The man who sold the coffin wrote the doctor, "Sir, I have sent you the best coffin I have, but I'm sorry to say that I have no lumber suitable for making the case, and it is impossible to get any. If you have any lumber on the plantation, have the grave curved up about 15 inches high, and you can have the coffin by 3 o'clock this evening. Please send 2 mules down to get it, because I can't provide any." And on the day that the Civil War ended, of course, the economic wherewithal of the doctor and his family went down to just about 0. Nothing would ever quite be the same for Letty and her sister, Mary. Their dear mother was gone. Adjustments, including even accepting the reality of the death, were difficult. When he recovered from his move, Jeff, the husband of the younger girl, took over management of Forest Place, and he did find it a struggle to organize a pattern of labor and to reopen the market for cotton. Because in the fall of 1865, the entire South was in a state of uncertainty and disarray. Federal troops, government and martial law. Some areas were much more lawless and hence dangerous than others. Austin, Texas was an especially unsettled place, and for that reason, they did move back to Mississippi for at least a year. But there was great tension at Forest Place. Jeff's role as plantation manager proved to be a difficult one for him. Worse, perhaps, Letty soon discovered that her father seemed to have a drinking problem, and maybe even was losing a bit of his mind as well. Sounds like the daddy and Gone with the Wind, doesn't it? The men of Carroll County essentially knew how to do but one thing to make a living, to raise cotton, and to do it with slave labor. Jeff rounded up labor as best he could, and he did raise cotton as well as corn. He kept a diary, and his words lend insight to the routine experiments with new ways to keep cotton flowing to the market and working out new ways to secure and use adequate hired labor. Eventually, sharecropping came to be a standard arrangement, but that did not prove so well for the folk of Forest Place. Dr. Watkins was a stiff, opinionated man, and ultimately the burdens of widowhood, the loss of his estate, the other realities that he faced caused him to decide late in 1866 to sell his place in Mississippi, selling furniture, packing up keepsakes, clearing the way for new owners. All this was complicated and quite traumatic. Gradually, the families adjusted to the realities of living under new circumstances. And of course, as generations came and went, the old ways of life became part of a bygone era. One last letter details what had become of some of the former family slaves. Interestingly, it also reflects the existence of some lingering affection. As I say, they didn't have any affection for being slaves, but they had affection for those people. The years passed, the letters began to appear from Letty's children. As they grew into young adulthood and went off to school, those members of the family that moved away from Mississippi gradually didn't remember Mississippi at all. Life on the plantation faded for the Watkinses and for the Waltons into ever more dimly recalled memories. And now it is only the letters from Forest Place that remain.
Could you give us any insight into how long it took these various letters to be delivered from point to point?
No, I'm afraid well, I probably could, although I'm not prepared to do so now. You could probably interpolate a lot of that because many of the letters begin with acknowledgement of some previous piece of correspondence. So you could, if you wanted to find that out, you could kind of sweep through a good chunk of these and begin to get a feel for how long it took. I, of course, am enormously interested in the mail system, the do know that in some cases it took a long time, but it all varied, it depended, because you have male runners that are active, and then of course, whenever anybody is going anywhere, they're often called upon to personally transport letters. So I think doubtless some letters moved very rapidly, although the Confederate Postal Service itself, while on the one hand, from an economic perspective, was efficient because the Confederate Congress and the Confederate Constitution required that the Postal Service be self-supporting. On the other hand, was, which is something that the U.S. Postal Service had never succeeded in doing. But they achieved that at the expense of cutting back on less profitable routes and more rural locations. So in that sense, so if you had the good luck to be somewhere where a mail runner visited, for example, even during the Vicksburg siege, a mail runner got in with a small boatload of mail. So that was a big deal. So if you had the good fortune of being on the right end of a mail runner or something like that, but on the other hand, it might take quite a long time. I should like to share this with you. Many years ago now, I did research for an article that was eventually published in the Civil War History, a popular magazine called Via Confederate Post. And then a few years after that, I was invited to come down and address the Mississippi State Historical Society, and I did. And well, I have a big stack of notes left over that I didn't use in that other article, and so I made a speech out of that. And they'd like to publish that article if I could ever get myself straightened out and calmed down enough to write it up. I think we'd have another article published on the Confederate mail system.
Other questions?
Sure.
That winds up a very fast-paced two-day program that we have had here. What I would like to offer any of our guests who have just come this evening, either to ask questions that you may wish to ask the General right now, the expertise that we have here, Mark Grimsley, Dr. Mark Grimsley, raise your hand, Mark, supposed to see you. Back there is from Ohio State University. He has written the book, The Hard Hand of War, of which he has detailed in great length the policies relating to the federal treatment in Mississippi during the war. Of course, we have Herman Hattaway, who's extremely broad-based on both sides of the philosophical and practical elements of the war. And we also have who else am I missing here? Parker Hills, who is a local Mississippi military historian here. So if there are any questions that you might like to ask, you certainly don't have to feel obliged to. If you would like to just ask them one-on-one when we break up,